There was a moment in the late 1970s when the streets went quiet. If you were there, you remember the silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a mourning. The ground-shaking idol of high compression, big blocks had vanished, replaced by the wheezing cough of smog-choked engines struggling to pull heavy steel bodies through a world that no longer wanted them. The golden era of American muscle hadn't just ended, it had been executed. Insurance companies, oil embargoes, and suffocating emissions regulations had conspired to kill the V8 engine. By 1978, the Ford Mustang, the car that had once defined a generation of freedom, had withered into the Mustang II, a glorified economy car sharing parts with the Pinto. The handwriting wasn't just on the wall, it was etched into the asphalt. The V8 was dead. The future was slow, quiet, and efficient. Or, so we were told. But history rarely moves in a straight line. Just as the automotive world prepared to bury the performance car forever, something unexpected happened in Dearborn. It wasn't a miracle, and it certainly wasn't flashy. It was a decision born of desperation and adaptability. Ford introduced a new platform, internally designated as the Fox. It was boxy, lightweight, and utilitarian. It was designed to carry sedans and wagons, to be practical above all else, yet, buried within that chassis was the potential for a revolution. This is the story of how an unassuming, angular car and an old pushrod engine didn't just survive the extinction event, they single-handedly saved the American V8 from the history books. To understand the magnitude of this, you have to look at the landscape of 1979. Performance was a dirty word. Horsepower numbers had plummeted into the double digits or low hundreds. A performance car in the late 70s was often just a decal package and a slightly stiffer suspension. But when the 1979 Mustang debuted on the Fox platform, it brought something crucial back to the table. Potential. It was lighter than its predecessors, far more aerodynamic, and it had an engine bay that could technically swallow a V8, even if the regulations made it difficult to make that V8 breathe. The engine that would become a legend wasn't new technology. It was the 302 cubic inch Windsor V8, a workhorse that had been around since the late 60s. But in the Fox body, it began a transformation. At first, it was humble. The early 5.0-liter engines were choked by carburetors and vacuum lines, struggling to make 140 horsepower. But the engineers at Ford, specifically a group of rogue enthusiasts who refused to let the flame die, saw the math differently. They realized that because the Fox body was so light featherweight compared to the behemoths of the early 70s, they didn't need 400 horsepower to make the car exciting. They just needed torque. And they needed to let the engine breathe. Asterisk, the turning point came in 1982. Ford threw down the gauntlet with a simple marketing slogan, "The boss is back." They reintroduced the GT model, and under the hood sat the 5.0 high output. It wasn't a monster by modern standards, producing around 157 horsepower, but in the context of 1982, it was a revelation. It was snappy. It had a dual snorkel air cleaner that sucked in air with a sound we hadn't heard in a decade. It proved that Ford wasn't ready to surrender the streets to the imports just yet. This was the spark. It wasn't a raging inferno, but it was enough to light the fuse. As the 1980s progressed, a fascinating arms race began, not just between manufacturers, but between the engineers and the government. Every time regulations tightened, Ford's engineers found a work. They swapped camshafts. They moved from heavy cast iron intake manifolds to aluminum. They tweaked cylinder heads. But the true revolution arrived in 1986 with the introduction of sequential electronic fuel injection. For the old-school hot rodders, this was terrifying. They looked at the wires, the sensors, and the computer modules, and they declared the hobby dead. You couldn't tune a computer with a screwdriver, they said, but they were wrong. The move to fuel injection didn't kill the hot rod, it perfected it. The 5.0-liter engine became a model of consistency. It started every morning, it idled smoothly in traffic, and when you mashed the throttle, it responded instantly. The 1987 Mustang GT, with its aero nose and ground effects, arrived with 225 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque. Those numbers might seem modest today, but on the street in 1987, against cars costing 3 times as much, the 5.0 Mustang was a terror. It was cheap speed. It was democratized power. This accessibility is what truly saved the V8. The Fox Body Mustang was affordable. A kid working a summer job could almost afford the payments. Suddenly, high school parking lots across America weren't filled with sensible sedans. They were filled with the rumble of 5.0 seconds. This created a culture. An entire aftermarket industry exploded almost overnight. Companies like Flowmaster, BBK, and Paxton superchargers grew massive because of this one engine. The 5.0 became the Lego set of engines. You could bolt on parts in your driveway on a Saturday morning and go race that night. It taught a new generation that mechanical performance wasn't some arcane magic reserved for the wealthy. It was something you could build with your own hands. However, the survival of the V8 wasn't just about engineering. It was about a war for the soul of the company. In the mid-80s, facing rising fuel standards, Ford executives made a decision that seems unthinkable now. They decided the Mustang had run its course. They planned to replace the rear-wheel drive, V8-powered Mustang with a front-wheel drive, Mazda-based coupe. They were going to call it the Mustang. The V8 was to be phased out, a relic of the past, replaced by high-tech V6 South and turbos. When word of this leaked famously through an article in Automotive, the backlash was nuclear. Thousands of letters poured into Ford's headquarters. Enthusiasts were outraged. They didn't want a polished, polite Japanese-engineered coupe. They wanted the raw, unrefined kick of a V8 driving the rear wheels. They wanted the burnout. They wanted the noise. The outcry was so deafening that Ford retreated. They released the front-wheel drive car as the Probe, and they kept the Fox Body Mustang alive. That moment was the pivot point. If Ford had proceeded with their plan, the American V8 likely would have withered away, becoming a niche engine for trucks and luxury barges. The Mustang saved the architecture by proving people still bought it with their hearts, not just their calculators. The 5.0 moniker itself became bigger than the car. It became a cultural icon. Vanilla Ice rapped about it. It was the police interceptor of choice, the SSP Mustang that chased down Porsches on the highway. It transcended being just a displacement number and became a brand. It represented a specific kind of American attitude, loud, slightly brash, but undeniably capable. It bridged the gap between the baby boomers who grew up with muscle cars and Generation X who were looking for their own identity. We also have to credit the rivalry. The Chevrolet Camaro and Pontiac Firebird were fighting the same fight, but the Fox Body forced GM to stay in the game. If the Mustang had died or gone front-wheel drive, GM would have likely killed the F-Body platform shortly after. The fierce competition between the 5.0 Mustang and the tuned port-injection Camaros kept the engineers up at night, pushing for just 5 more horsepower, just a tenth of a second faster in the quarter mile. This competition drove the technology forward, forcing the refinement that would eventually lead to the modern LS and Coyote engines we revere today. The magic of the Fox Body 5.0 wasn't that it was the fastest car in the world. It had brakes that were barely adequate, a chassis that flexed like a wet noodle, and an interior made of brittle plastic. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the connection. When you turned the key, the car shook. When you dropped the clutch, the rear tires spun. It was visceral. It was a machine that required a driver. In an era where cars were becoming increasingly isolated and numb, the 5.0 was a raw nerve. By the time the Fox platform was finally retired in 1993, the automotive landscape had changed completely. The V8 wasn't dead. It was thriving. The 5.0 had kept the pilot light burning through the darkest, coldest winter of automotive history. It handed the torch to the SN95, and eventually, the modular engines, ensuring that the lineage remained unbroken. The modern horsepower wars where we see 700, 800 horsepower showroom cars are direct descendants of that 225 horsepower GT from 1987. We often look at history through the lens of the greatest or the most expensive, but sometimes the hero isn't the king. It's the soldier. The Fox Body Mustang was that soldier. It held the line when everything else was retreating. It proved that efficiency and emotion didn't have to be enemies. It took the V8, which was being suffocated by bureaucracy, and taught it how to use a computer. It adapted to survive, but it never lost its soul. So, the next time you hear the distinct, hollow echo of a 5.0-liter V8 with Flowmaster mufflers, don't just hear a loud exhaust. Hear the sound of defiance. Hear the sound of the engine that refused to go quietly into the night. Because without that boxy, underestimated car, the roar of the American V8 would be nothing more than a memory. A ghost story told by old men about a time when giants walked the earth. Instead, the giant is still here, breathing fire. All because the Fox Body dared to keep its heart beating.